welcome to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth, and we're here to preserve and promote culture in this benighted age, one weekly conversation at a time. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show through iTunes, or by plugging our RSS feed into your favorite podcatcher. You can find the RSS feed on our websites, vmspod.com or chimeraobscura.com/vm. We're also on Twitter and Instagram at vmspod, at virtualmemoriespodcast.tumblr.com, and on Spotify, YouTube, and TuneIn.com by searching for Virtual Memories Show. And visit patreon.com/vmspod or paypal.me/vmspod to make a one-time or recurring contribution and help me continue to produce smart conversation about books, art, comics, and culture every week at the Virtual Memories Show. All right, last week was some silly running around for work, a couple of days in Philadelphia for trade show, Friday visit to the FDA that turned out to be less than useful. But I topped it all off with a Saturday morning run with the running group I've taken up with, where I doubled the longest distance I have ever gone in the 11 months since I took up running. It was, coincidentally, 11 miles this time, which goes, as far as I'm concerned, to prove a couple of things. One, I'm better at running than I thought I was. And two, as with most other things in my life, I work better when there's a template I can build off of. I'm not so great with uncharted territory. If I'm running on my own, I tend to lose mental focus, or I stop at a certain set distance, etc. But running with a group where someone else is setting the pace works a lot better for me than going solo. Much like with the podcast, I may not have come up with this whole model and way of doing it on my own if I hadn't had Mark Maron's example of WTF to build off of, with the, somewhat rambling introduction and conversation with interesting artistic people. I will admit, with my day job, I had no clear model to build a nonprofit trade association and become a lobbyist, but I did get some decent advice after I got things rolling and was able to fine-tune the experience from there. Either way, going 11 miles this weekend and having a ton of energy in reserve for the last mile plus, like I really cooked near the end. The leader of the running group, he and I basically just went knowing that everybody else was kind of slowing down and knew their way back to the last point. That means I think that I have to start looking at longer races than the few 5Ks I've done so far. One way of looking at this is I will be 50 in a year and a half, and that could maybe be a good milestone for my first very long run modeled after an ancient Greek war story. We're not going to say the M word, but I will start looking at going longer distances, and you will unfortunately have to suffer commentary about them here in the introductions or in my occasional weekly email. There is a connection to the show, though, because this week's guest also found himself doing better, longer work late in his career. He is Bill Griffith, the cartoonist behind the long-running strip Zippy the Pinhead. Bill was on the show in 2015 for a sort of double episode when he published Invisible Ink, his graphic memoir about his mother's infidelity with a famous cartoonist of that era. He's back now with the graphic biography Nobody's Fool, The Life and Times of Schlitzie the Pinhead from Abrams Comic Arts. See, Bill's life was changed, we'll say, when he saw the 1932 movie Freaks and got his first exposure to Schlitzie the Pinhead, a microcephalic sideshow performer who is part of the cast of Freaks. And he could draw a line from that experience in like 1960 to the cartoonist that he would become around the late 60s into the 70s. And Nobody's Fool serves as a tribute to Schlitzie and his impact on Bill's life. But it does something more. Nobody's Fool is both loving and unsentimental. as biographies go. And it also brings in Bill's own story and how it leads him to create Zippy the Pinhead. But it's really about this sideshow freak. Freak was an accepted term back then, and we talk a little about that in the conversation. Bill's done a ton of research on Schlitzie and his milieu. He's also interviewed the few surviving figures who knew Schlitzie. Schlitzie lived from about 1901 to 1971. What the real accomplishment of this book is that it humanizes Schlitzie the Pinhead, and it captures the circus and sideshow cultures, the way mass entertainment changes over that course of the 20th century, the question of exploitation of people with disabilities, not just microcephalics, but the other people within the sideshow. He gets into the historical oddity of freaks even getting made, the problems with the studio, the way it gets re-released and becomes a cult hit, and ultimately gets to the tragedy of a life like Schlitzie's for a simple-minded person when there's no one left to take care of them. It says a lot about, social networks, as it were, the importance of the people who actually do care and give. As I mentioned in our conversation, there is a part of this book that made me cry, and that is not something that happens easily. Nobody's Fool is a remarkable piece of work. In case you're not familiar with Bill's art, I should add it's drawn beautifully in black and white. The page layouts, the panel progressions, even if you're a comics newbie, you will be swept along. There's no learning curve in understanding how he's telling the story. And we get into that too, sort of the mechanics of how you make a comic. Nobody's Fool is a wonderful book. And I think it's fantastic that Bill has found a creative outlet in long form books without having to bail on the daily Zippy the Pinhead strips. Pick up Nobody's Fool wherever you get your books or comics, and go to zippythepinhead.com. You can also order it from there, inscribed by Bill, and you can sign up for the regular Zippy the Pinhead emails where they send you the daily strip. And as I put it in our conversation, you get a little Zen bomb to open the day. As caveats go, not a lot. We recorded in my hotel at the Toronto Comic Arts Festival. There was a little truck noise outside early on, but that was about it. Here's Bill's bio from Nobody's Fool. Bill Griffith is a creator of the syndicated daily comic strip Zippy. Griffith's prolific output has been included in such publications as The Village Voice, National Lampoon, and The New Yorker. According to Bartlett, Griffith coined the popular phrase, "Are we having fun yet?" He lives in Hadlime, Connecticut, and also Dingberg. His new book is Nobody's Fool, The Life and Times of Schlitzie the Pinhead. And now, the 2019 Virtual Memories Conversation with Bill Griffith. What was it like for you, working on a book like this so immediately after working on a very personal project with Invisible? I know they're both personal for you, but one that's tied to your family in Invisible Ink versus the biography of Schlitzie.
Well, in the same way that I felt it was time for me to deal with the fact that my mother had, in effect, handed me this incredible story when my father died and told me of her 16-year affair with a then famous cartoonist, no longer famous. I felt it was time to do it, and that it was, it had been percolating in the back of my head for decades. It was triggered by a visit to my uncle, her brother, who one evening, talking to him, he just asked me about if I thought my mother had an affair with a certain person. And I said, no, that would have been too dangerous because he lived right near the house. But she did have one with Lawrence Larrier. And then he was very surprised, but not shocked, knowing my mother. And that triggered an evening of Googling in my hotel that night. And when literally hundreds and hundreds of images popped up, both of his gag cartoons, his 4 failed daily strips, and his dozen or more mystery novels, I knew I had a book. Mm-hmm. I knew I had all the research done almost in one evening. But in addition to that, my mother had left me 2 huge diaries and a 382-page unfinished family saga novel in which all of the family members were thinly disguised. The only family member missing was me. And go figure. How did
that make you feel?
Good and bad.
Yeah.
Good that I wasn't...
That you didn't find out what she thought of you?
Right, because my sister was treated as a sort of an emotional wreck who tried to kill herself, which is not true. And my father was characterized by being a failed businessman and an alcoholic. Neither one of those was true, but he was, in effect, kind of a failure, at least in her eyes. But anyway, so when I finished Invisible Ink, I thought, okay, I've done this now for 3 years. I've been working 7 days a week. I need a break. So I took about 2 months. A break for me, of course, means doing 7 strips a week.
Right.
And after 2 months, I started to feel what I can only describe as an empty nest syndrome or an empty graphic novel syndrome.
Yeah.
And I thought, what else has been percolating? And it popped right up, which was to do a book both examining, researching, and honoring the inspiration for Zippy, which is Schlitzie the Pinhead, the real-life circus sideshow performer, whose life is very, very sketchily known. But once I dug deep into that and talked to especially people who worked with him and knew him, the book began to form. So I went back to working 7 days a week, happily, and now I'm doing it again.
With a biography of Bushmiller?
I'm doing a graphic bio of Ernie Bushmiller, which I'm about 75 pages into, which will be also an Abrams book, as Nobody's Fool is. And yeah, I guess I'm a late-life graphic novelist.
And I guess that's the question I was wondering, because I remember when we sat down to talk about Invisible Ink, you showed me a little bit of Nobody's Fool in the process, but I don't think I really considered what it meant for you to adopt long-form graphic novels concurrently with 7 strips a day, or 7 strips a week, because you don't seem to ever take Zippy off.
No.
Yeah, you've never gone on a hiatus of any kind with it, right?
I did in the mid-'90s.
Okay.
I went through a rough period where I took 6 months off. Mm-hmm. So they ran reprints. Yeah. That was it.
And it's absurd enough you could get away with some of them.
A lot of people, yeah.
Is that new? Is that not new?
They don't remember, right. It's a lot to digest.
But what's it been like for you, like finding this form? I mean, we knew that the long-form graphic novel existed, but finding that you're capable of doing it and that you have stories to tell. And
well, first of all, it felt totally natural. Yeah. And second of all, it felt like a huge relief.
How's that?
Because starting with Art Spiegelman's Mouse, which was 1986, I believe.
Yeah.
The first thing I thought of after I read that and loved it, the first thing I thought was, do I have one in me? Do I have a graphic novel in me? And my answer to myself was yes, but not yet. I thought doing 7 strips a week was enough. I didn't want to tax myself too much. And when the time came, it would come. So it took however many years between that thought. It took, 20 years?
Yeah.
18 years. But you have to remember, when I was originally working in underground comics, I would routinely do stories with lengths of anywhere from 3 or 4 pages to as much as 20 pages. And I remember always feeling the 20-page story was the real enjoyment, that I could really do something. Mm-hmm. A short story is a short story. It's a slice of life, or it's a quick escapade, in Zippy's case, into some world. But a long story involves other characters. It involves, to some degree, a plot, and to some degree, a story structure, like the 3-act story structure that you're taught in basic writing class. Mm-hmm. When I started doing Invisible Ink, I was acutely aware of continuity and how crucial continuity is in long-form narrative. I teach comics at the School of Visual Arts, and that's the students. To say weak spot is to underplay the problem.
Yeah.
I have to ask them what the hell happened between this panel and that panel all the time. And their answer always is, in my head, it's all clear. And then I say, yes, but we're not in your head, so you have to make it clear. And I say, comic writing involves, compared to film writing, for instance, or film making, involves over-explaining, what looks like over-explaining. That's why you see the word soon over a panel. Or
meanwhile.
Meanwhile, next day. I learned all this from Scrooge McDuck, by the way, from Carl Barks. Soon, meanwhile, next day, those are all over the place. Next morning, he was doing what you have to do. In a movie, you're sitting in a movie theater, you're receiving the film in a passive state, literally through alpha waves through your brain. If you are enjoying the movie. If you're not, you look at the clock and you don't like it. But if you're involved with the movie, but you never say to yourself, or your little caveman brain never says, wait a minute, in 1 second I was on the street, and the next second I was inside a building. Your movie receptor brain doesn't care. It just happened.
It understands the cut as...
as kind of a visual language that you just accept immediately. If you do that in a comic, the first thing that comes up is, why did that happen? Where are you? Is it the next day? Is it the same time? All kinds of questions come up. So doing long-form narrative, what's really different about it to me is keeping the continuity smooth, which means a lot of, not so much rewriting as what I call bridge pages. So I will write a 5-page section, which I think will smoothly segue into the next 8-page section. And when I look at it later, or especially when my wife, Diane Newman, who is also a cartoonist, when she reads it, she'll see it immediately. My first reaction, of course, is, what are you talking about? It's beautiful the way it is.
Yeah. How dare you tell me how to make comics?
How dare you tell me how to make a change? Within 20 minutes, I'm busy making the change. Mm-hmm. It actually just happened the day before I left to come here on my Ernie book. It was a very minor kind of thing, but once she has great editorial judgment, first of all, and she has another pair of eyes. She's not me, so I get the editor / audience kind of view of what I'm doing from her. I wouldn't want to show it to anyone else, because I think you have to be in a very trusting relationship with someone for that to work. So continuity for me involves, when there is a continuity bump, what I almost always have to do then is thread the last scene into the next scene with a page or 2 or 3 or 4, whatever it takes. And once I do that, I'm okay until it happens again.
It reminds me, the first time I recorded with Roz Chast, she talked about doing that memoir book about her parents' deaths.
Yeah, great book, yeah.
And how she couldn't figure out how to get it all to work.
How to organize it. Right.
And her therapist finally said, have you ever thought about chapters?
Yeah.
And that was her, holy crap. Yes, you could stop something here and then start the action on the next chapter, and that opened her up, and the whole thing made sense at that
worked,
point.
Yeah. I thought
Your things tend to flow. There are phases, but they still tend to flow continuously, both of these books.
I considered chapters for both of my books. But I didn't feel like I really needed them. I just considered them because it's a form.
Yeah.
It's a traditional form, and certainly many novels take the form.
Yeah.
And it creates a slight pause. It organizes the work. But the other thing with the long-form narrative that I felt I just naturally did, but it was tricky. It was, it's hard to... It's a juggling act, which is to not tell everything chronologically. Mm-hmm. Just like in a movie, sometimes I take a lot of cues from films, and I realize there are a lot of cues I shouldn't take from films as well. But a movie will very often start basically in the middle of a scene. And the purpose is to pull you into the story quickly. It may or may not then chronologically connect to the next thing, but you're in. You've been pulled in. In both of these the long-form narratives I've done, I thought chronology, since they're both true stories that take place over a period of decades, I thought the boring way to do it is the chronological way. The more interesting way is to start at some point that's not the beginning point of the story, and then start threading the different elements together until they're connected. Mm-hmm. And in the case with Nobody's Fool, I started out when Schlitzie was in his 60s, at the end of his career, and I depicted his performance in Toronto at the National Canadian Exhibition Fairgrounds, because I had been told by by someone who worked with him in an interview about that period, and so I had detailed information to work with. But I thought I would start there, just to jump into who he was, and without a lot of explaining. So I have him performing. I've had the talker, by the way, the term in sideshow parlance is not barker. They don't say barker. They say talker.
Okay.
So the talker is spieling about these outrageous claims about Schlitzie has the brain the size of a golf ball. He subsists on nothing but swamp grass and banana leaves, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah. And Schlitzie, just sort of stood there. But then I thought, what would Schlitzie do when that happened? I'm trying to make him human. He had the cognitive ability of about a 4-year-old child. He was born with microcephaly, which means he had a smaller than average brain. But he could have human emotions. He had desires. He had an emotional life. He had a need for affection. He had food favorites. He had food he didn't like. So I always do the analogy of, if you've ever interacted with a 4-year-old child, you know that they're not simple. They have very complicated lives. Mm-hmm. And so did Schlitzie. So I thought in the opening scene I would go inside his head as he was being talked about. So I do a kind of, he closes his eyes and you go inside and you find out what he's thinking, because of course he's not really responding to the talker he's heard a million times. I was told by his last manager that he loved to do the dishes. So I just created this whole little fantasy inside his head where he's standing on the sideshow stage, and in his mind he's doing the dishes, which makes him happy. Mm-hmm. I love to do the dishes myself, by the way. Yeah. So that was nice to hear. So only then do I segue to his childhood, and I do that both graphically, and I lead up to it in terms of storytelling. So, and I come back to that point at the end of the book. Mm-hmm. See, the guy who gave me the insight that I really needed into Schlitzie's, who Schlitzie really was, not the sideshow Schlitzie, but the human being, was a man named Wolf Krakowski, who spent 3 months in 1965 touring Canada with Schlitzie. He was a Toronto native. Well, not native. Wolf Krakowski was born in Sweden from parents who had escaped the Holocaust. So he had a long history before he got here, but he then ran the bumper car concession at the Conklin and Garrett Circus and Sideshow, and he spent 3 months traveling with Schlitzie. He roomed next door to Schlitzie. He saw Schlitzie every day. He took the car to work with Schlitzie. He took the car back from work to the hotel with Schlitzie, and he gave me insight into Schlitzie as a person. Mm-hmm. And so the beginning of the book is because of stuff he told me, and the end of the book, I actually reproduced one of my interviews with him. And you have to remember, the sideshow people were not necessarily the smartest people in the world in the usual intellectual sense, but Wolfe was. Wolfe spent that 3 months. The book he carried with him that he was determined to finish that summer was Being and Nothingness by Jean-Paul Sartre.
Yeah.
Okay. So this is a thoughtful, sensitive human being, and he had a thoughtful, sensitive impression of Schlitzie. He felt privileged to be in Schlitzie's presence.
Did the idea for the book originate before the research really came together for you?
Yes.
And was there a stretch where I can't do this book unless I find that humanizing thing?
Right. The initial impulse of the book was to kind of honor the inspiration for Zippy, who is Schlitzie. Zippy came out of me watching the movie Freaks at the age of 19, very impressionable age.
The scene in the book is pretty.
Yeah, 1963.
Up, yeah.
I mean, just to see a black and white movie from 1932 in 1963, to see it on a fairly big screen was hallucinogenic to begin with. You know, that period of art house cinema, that's where Humphrey Bogart was rediscovered, the Marx Brothers, W.C. Fields. Freaks was in that mix. Mm-hmm. It was a window into a bygone time, as well as, in Freaks' case, a great story. Of course, Bogart, also great stories, but not so much the Marx Brothers and W.C. Fields. That's just mostly humor. But the reality of those films, the way it felt to get absorbed into that at that age and at that time was very powerful. And when I came out of it, I mean, I felt like I had literally, gone on an acid trip way before I would even consider taking acid. It just felt like my brain had been, fried and rearranged or something. I remember coming back to my Brooklyn apartment and thinking, I have to make art out of this somehow. I don't know how. But I was not a cartoonist. My ambition at that point was to be discovered as a painter, to just paint, get shows and it was all very amorphous, kind of a romantic idea of what an artist was. I'd been a big comics reader as a kid, but starting at the age of about 14, I discovered poetry, and specifically Ginsberg and Kerouac and Lawrence Ferlinghetti, and I thought comics were something from my childhood, and I was graduating from my childhood to a more mature place. And then when I started to draw and paint, I also thought, it didn't even occur to me to be a cartoonist. I'm looking back on that as my childhood. So from 1963 to 1970, I didn't have the tools creatively to do anything with Schlitzie. I tried a few paintings, but I had nothing but a memory. There's no internet.
No Google image search.
No images. You couldn't Google image search.
Yeah.
There was one postcard, which I found just before I started doing the first Zippy strip in 1970. A fellow cartoonist had a collection of Sideshow Freak postcards. And that was my only image, even then, my only photograph reference. So I had to become a cartoonist, and I had to find some reference material. And even then, I only did the first Zippy strip thinking it was a one-shot idea. But Zippy's, the way he looked was literally based on Schlitzie. The way he acted was more me. I mean, it was more me playing with the idea of someone whose awareness, his mind worked without a filter. He didn't have a little voice that said, don't say that. Mm-hmm. So he would say one thing after another after another. My intention was always to play up the absurdity of that. And people always say Zippy speaks in non sequiturs. That's not quite true. It's a little bit like writing poetry. And poetry is full of non sequiturs, if you want to put it that way, but it doesn't really describe. It's wordplay. It's image play. It's one thing leading to another for some through somebody else's eyes. That it's not you. You're pulled along for a ride.
I can't recall if I used the term when we spoke last time, but Zen bomb is what I used for when I would open your strips in the morning by email, and it would just just detonate my brain with a combination of words that
the famous radio personality Ken Nordine called it word jazz.
Nice. Yeah.
So Zippy speaks a little bit like he's playing a musical instrument. The musical instrument is his speech and his brain, and he's playing it. So that didn't come from Schlitzie in the movie Freaks. That came from me.
Yeah. But doing the book, knowing that you had some story, but not knowing as much as you were able to research about Schlitzie, did you sort of start more amorphously until things started to come together with the research?
Yes, it was. I worked as I researched, hand in hand. Mm-hmm. I didn't do all the research first and then do the book. I researched while I was doing the book. When I thought I had enough critical mass, fact-wise, to begin, I did. But one thing in internet research leads to another thing. Yeah. And often you're led down a path that comes to a dead end or doesn't seem true or believable.
Or cat videos.
Or you wind up watching cat video. Yeah, how many times? Yeah, I'm not that.
Yeah, but it always happens.
But I would start watching, Cliff Edwards playing his banjo all of a sudden, something like that. And then I have to pull myself out of it. I used a kind of journalistic approach. I always tried to corroborate everything. Hmm. For instance, in 1962, Zippy, okay, here I go. Zippy and Schlitzie.
You're always going to fall back in the wrong.
They go back and forth in my head. In 1962, after appearing at the Cow Palace in San Francisco, Schlitzie appearing at the Cow Palace, the teenage boys of the Bay Area went into barbershops and demanded the Schlitzie haircut. In the dozens of them, maybe even hundreds. When I first read that, I thought, this is fake. It's got to be fake. It's just too...
It's too perfect.
I hope it isn't fake. Please make it not be. And I indeed found two other corroborative pieces of evidence.
Wow. Because I thought that may have been embellishment when I saw it in the book.
It was in the San Francisco Chronicle. Wow. It was also in the Examiner, and it was also in the Oakland Tribune. So it was a real thing. There were no photographs, but they talked about it. So, I did research as I worked. I would come up with these wonderful nuggets. The Schlitzie performed on the same stage in the same period, also 1962, as the Beach Boys. One of the Beach Boys, I think it was their first public appearance. He also appeared on the same stage in the same place, also in Toronto, as the Three Stooges, and his very last appearance, Schlitzie's last public appearance, in an indoor circus in the L.A. Coliseum. The MC who introduced Schlitzie to the world was Ed Sullivan. I mean, these were just huge gifts handed to me. I get to draw Ed Sullivan. I get to draw the Three Stooges. I get to draw, all these wonderful...
And that ties in the Drew Friedman demographic you're trying to get. I'm just kidding. Only if you get Shemp in there instead. But were there aspects that had to be rewritten or rejiggered as you...
Well, my approach, aside from somewhat of a journalistic approach, because I wanted to be as true as I could about things, was fly on the wall. Okay, so I gave myself permission, artistic license. Once I had gathered a certain degree of information, that I would then let myself imagine what a scene would be like. A scene that it couldn't have been reported. Yeah. For instance, when Schlitzie was first sold into the sideshow in Coney Island when he was very young, what would that have been like? I knew who bought him, and I found a picture of him, a guy named Stephen Mills in 1909. who ran the Dreamland Coney Island sideshow. He went looking for some reason in the Bronx, where Schlitzie lived, and asked people, were there any strange characters living in the neighborhood? And somebody said, yeah, there's a weird little pinhead boy upstairs. So I tried to imagine what that must have been like, because he was indeed sold out of his family. So I pictured his mother as being reluctant, but they were poor. They already had a number of children. As far as I can tell, Schlitzie was born into a German-Jewish immigrant family in the Bronx in 1901. Genealogically, I had a genealogist do his damnedest. I couldn't ever completely 100% find Schlitzie genealogically, but I found pretty close. Yeah. And so in that case, I decided to create a dramatic point, because it was indeed dramatic in his life. So I made his father be kind of money grubbing and his mother be reluctant and ultimately regretful. I don't have any evidence that that's true. Yeah. But it very well might have been. So I gave myself that license to do that. I did that a number of times in the book.
Yeah, did you feel I don't know, say responsibility, but the difference between journalism and fictionalizing these things?
Well, you know, need to... biography these days is very fluid.
Yeah, true.
So I'm part of a phenomenon where a biographer will do a lot of careful research and do a lot of corroborative back and forth, but who ultimately will invent to some degree, but always based on what probably happened. It's been true forever in biography. It's more true now than it used to be. It's been extremely true in film biopics.
Oh yeah. We'll change some of the facts because we want a better dramatic story.
I mean, what was the famous one where is a biography of Handel or Schubert, a classical composer who hears his famous the motif of his symphony. The birds are singing as he's walking down a lane, and that becomes the motif of his. So that's the silly aspect of it. But I did reinvent or invent certain scenes. Yes.
One of the things that strikes me with the book is that you don't go for the easy emotional cues. I mean, yes, he gets taken away from his mother and he's crying and she's regretful, but you don't hit sentimental beats doing this, you know. That's
been said to me many times, and I'm very happy to hear it, because I really...
Yeah, I mean it in a good way, because it's too easy to make this...
Sentimentality is the opposite of true feeling. Mm-hmm. It's fake feeling, or it's manipulative feeling. I wanted to make this book full of emotion, but as authentic emotion as I could make it be, both from just my storytelling and from what I knew about the characters. A fully realized person in a biography, making them sentimental is the death of believability. Yeah. It just doesn't work. It happens quite often. I was determined not to make that happen. I have to give a lot of credit to my wife, Diane, in that regard, too, for keeping the book as full of feeling as I could without stepping out into that sentimental or...
Yeah, it doesn't become maudlin. It doesn't use Zippy or Schlitzie as an object of pity. Exactly. You don't render him like that.
Well, you know, Schlitzie himself told me he wasn't an object of pity.
Yeah.
Schlitzie's default mood from everybody that dealt with him, especially the two people who gave me long interviews, his default mood was happy. Yeah. Now, yes, you could say he was exploited. Yes, he was. You could say there were moments in his sideshow career when he was treated badly, usually by the audience, not by the management. Yes, that did happen. But if he if he had stayed with his parents in the Bronx, in their little cold water flat, I did research this to the degree I could. Handicapped children at that time, there was no social safety net. There was no social welfare. They were usually hidden away. They were kept out of public view. They were objects of shame for their family. They were also burdens financially because they couldn't work. So Schlitzie would have been like that. He might have had a much less happy, darker, shorter life had he stayed with his parents, ironically. In the sideshow, he was a member of a bigger family, a family that cared about him. In sideshow attitudes, there are two levels that I could gather that were common in this family sense that sideshow performers lived out. One was the whole sideshow performing family. They did treat themselves as a unit. They were all in this together. They usually were put in the same hotel whenever they got taken from town to town, so they were physically always together. That was the larger sense. But in a smaller sense inside that were the members of the sideshow who had either a mental or a physical handicap. They were even more family. They were even more protected. When Schlitzie was first given into the sideshow, the bearded lady became a surrogate mother for him. He had surrogate mothers and fathers all during his life, people who really they cared for him partly because it was a code of behavior, but also because he was likable. Yeah. Everybody that tells me who saw Schlitzie perform tells me the same thing, that what got you interested in him was how sweet and happy he was. That you go to sideshows to see people being bizarre and exotic and possibly unhappy or in pain, and Schlitzie was the opposite. In my family, on my wife's side, there's a microcephalic child. She's 12, and she's Schlitzie. Yeah. When I have seen her on family occasions, she does all the things that Schlitzie's reported to have done. She mimics everybody around her and laughs. She runs back and forth doing little pranks. She repeats words over and over sometimes in a kind of a way to amuse herself. Yes, she's handicapped, and her parents have a lifelong commitment to her. So I'm not trying to gloss that over. But I would say she is happy. Happier than most people. Happier and, of course, limited. But, there's a big but there. But the happiness is largely what I think people liked about Schlitzie. They thought he was likable. Yeah. He was somebody they could like.
We live in a somewhat politically correct age. Do you regret ever using pinhead as the term for Zippy? At the time, I'm sure it wasn't an issue when you were launching the strips and stuff, but is it something that...
No, not really. Okay. First of all, I grew up with the word pinhead. My father called me a pinhead.
Yeah. Oh, don't get me wrong. I mean, we use these terms all the time.
My first impression of the word pinhead was that you're a jerk, you're stupid, or whatever. You're a moron. My use of the word pinhead is supposed to be ironic, just like "Are we having fun yet?" is supposed to be ironic. Right. Of course, most people think they have a bumper sticker that says "Are we having fun yet?" They say, "Yeah, let's party." My intent with that was to, if you ask if you're having fun while you're having fun, what's going on? Yeah. Anyway, yeah. My basic purpose in making, aside from acknowledging the inspiration for Zippy, was to make Schlitzie as human as possible.
Yeah. I think I told you in an email after I read it that I cried in one portion of this, and that does not happen with prose or comics. So,
I've heard that quite a bit.
Yeah, and not in a cheap emotional way, as we were saying. You really, yeah.
I really like to hear that. I also cried a number of times. Schlitzy's very sympathetic. When I say human, I mean sympathetic, someone that or empathetic, someone that you can see. You can see his humanity through his strangeness. You can see through the strangeness to who he was, that he was an interesting, funny, sweet person. When I gave my talk today, there was a person in the back. I couldn't see him, just his head. Later I saw he was in a wheelchair, and I think he didn't have anything below the waist. I think he was like Johnny Eck, the
who you
so-called half-boy.
Included in the book.
Yes. Yeah. And he asked me the question about whether I thought in any way I was exploiting handicapped people. And when I told him that my purpose was to make Schlitzy human and for the reader to be sympathetic to him, he was satisfied with that answer. And he said he came to my table later and had me sign his book, and he said something else which was true, which was, yes, he was giving me a pass on making fun of handicapped people, but the movie Freaks was not made by the freaks. The movie Freaks was made by a non-freak. Todd Browning was not,
Although you point out he was a sideshow.
He was a sideshow performer.
Yeah,
but he was
not actually.
He was in the
disabled.
skillful area, not in the handicapped area.
Right.
Like he had all his limbs and all that stuff. So, yes, I mean, there's always an element of in Schlitzy's in approaching Schlitzy where you come up against this point. You have to ask yourself: am I in any way doing what these teenage boys would do when they tormented him by throwing lit cigarettes at him? Am I doing that at all? If I had said yes to that, I couldn't have done the book. So I have to let it that verdict come from the reader, but I don't think I was doing that. It certainly wasn't my intent. Yeah.
And the idea of integrating your own story into it, I mean, you mentioned from the beginning the idea was a tribute to the thing that you've built your art on. It takes a long time before Bill Griffith appears in the book. It's more than halfway through. You do make a couple of allusions to research, but there's no present moment.
Talk about continuity. That chapter was moved around.
That's what I was wondering.
10 times.
It comes so late that it's one of those. I imagine there was an idea of putting it.
I had it at the beginning. I had it right after the beginning. I had it in many. I had it at the end, and finally, it was just a question of putting it at the right place and then constantly reading through. And when it was finally in the right place, it read through smoothly. So I hope that succeeded. It did for me. But yeah, I had to. If this is a kind of homage to the inspiration for Zippy, then I had to talk about how that came to me, how I first saw the movie Freaks and where that led next. So it was, the book is partly about, one of the headlines for the book could be, Bill Griffith explains where Zippy comes from.
Yeah.
Right. So that's I felt I had to put that in. Yeah.
Now, you've got Invisible Ink, this, and a bio of Bush Miller. And while you said you have fictionalized portions of this, have you considered long-form fiction at this point?
I have. So probably my fourth.
Yeah. Not to jinx anything.
No,
but,
it will be. My fourth book, it's very early thinking, but I've always wanted to do a long narrative form with my first character, Mr. the Toad. Mr. the Toad, I did originally after reading Wind in the Willows, just sometime in the early 60s. I just drew my version of what he might look like. When I first started doing my very first comics in 1968 for Underground Papers in New York, he was my character. And it was loosely based on the egomaniacal, out-of-control character in Wind in the Willows, Mr. Toad. After 5 or 6 years, or maybe 10 altogether, going back and forth, doing stories and strips about him, he began to scare me too much. I used to have dreams where he would be waiting outside my apartment with a baseball bat. At one point, he alternated between his face and my father's face. So I decided to retire him. I don't know exactly what year, maybe sometime in the mid to late 70s. But he refused to be retired. So I brought him back. Once I started doing my daily strip, I brought him back again. But I changed him a little. I made him less harmful and just more like the dark figure at the end of the bar. You're in a bar, you order your drink, and you see there's a guy in the end of the bar. He's in shadow. He's having a drink. He looks very intense. You're fascinated by him. You're a little worried if you talk to him what he might say. So that Mr. Toad started to come back into my strips, and I've done now many. And I have no idea what the story would be like, but it would be fictional. It would not be. I would not be talking about Wind in the Willows.
Yeah.
That would not enter into it.
Mm-hmm. And no thought of adaptations or anything?
Of Wind in the Willows?
Or anything. I mean, I recently did one with Peter Cooper where we talked about his Kafka and the fact that he's working on a Heart of Darkness adaptation. No, it's a very different vibe.
It's conceivable, but if I do indeed do number 4, a graphic novel, I would like to move away from biography and material based on real events and people, and do something that would be more novelistic and fictional.
Do you feel you made a leap between Invisible Ink and Nobody's Fool? Do you see things you did here that you couldn't have done, storytelling, etc., not based on the content, but things you picked up on in terms of how to construct long form?
All I can say is probably.
Okay. Yeah, I wasn't sure if you were aware of stuff or if Diane pointed out.
I'm not aware of that. Yeah.
Was anything easier going?
Maybe I should read both. I've read Nobody's Fool now, I think, 3 times since it came out. What I should do is read Invisible Ink and Nobody's Fool both in one sitting, and then I could answer your question.
Yes, I wonder if there's whatever age you're at, once you start working in a different form like that, whether there are things that you pick up.
Oh, yeah.
I can do this when I couldn't do that in 4 panels.
Yeah, it's like any skill. It gets better by perseverance, by repetitive.
Supposedly, but I get worse at this every time. I'm just kidding.
If I start to get worse, somebody has to tell me, but they haven't told me yet.
No, that was the first time you and I spoke. That was something that really struck me, because your art is so much tighter now than it is in like the 80s and 90s ones, and I was just struck by that. And you're like, well, yeah, I've been doing this daily for 40 fucking years, Gil. So, yeah, if I don't get better at this is a real problem. So. Yeah,
well, when I first started doing comics, I remember whenever I came out with my my big anthology from Fantagraphics, Lost and Found, Kim Thompson said to me, "What happened to you around 1972 or 3? Did you take a talent pill?" Because the difference between the 1971 strips and the 1972 and 3 strips is like 2 different people, he said. And I hadn't really thought of it until I went back and looked at it. Yeah, you're right. What did happen? I don't know. Mm-hmm. I broke through something, and then I broke through something again 5 years later, and I broke through another one. I'm not, Robert Crumb, Bob Armstrong, those are my 2 touchstones for people who are natural cartoonists. There are lots of others. I'm just telling you 2 of them. Yeah. 2 of them. Yeah. Both of them started drawing comics when they were small children, and they just kept doing it. Crumb did beautiful drawings of ocean liners in perspective at the age of 7. He once showed me these drawings, and I said, "Wow, why did you pick that subject?" And he said, "Well, he can't. He doesn't see depth. He has no depth perception." So he was fascinated by perspective because it's rules on how to show depth perception.
Yeah.
So we drew these ocean liners because they were docked and your point of view was below, and so you had upward perspective and downward, and it was all very fascinating to him because it was kind of like this is how he could experience perspective by drawing it.
I've never heard that. That's amazing.
Yeah. I always drew or did something like painting or whatever as a kid, but nothing like Crumb or Bob Armstrong. Robert was doing long form narratives at the age of 7, 8, 9 with his brother. I'm a late bloomer when it comes to that. I was always kind of an artist, and I thought I would be a painter, and I went to art school, and I tried my hand at painting. But when I came to comics, it was because of Crumb. I remember in 1967, late 67, early 68, I saw, I don't know which issue of Zap it was. I saw it actually in a Times Square, sleazy bookstore. Not quite porno, but on the edge of porno. And I brought it home, and the first thing I thought after I laughed my head off was, how did this guy get inside my head?
Yeah.
It's as if I did this. So the arrogance of that is quite amazing. I mean, when I look at just a month or two ago, there was a big show, I think it's down now, at the David Zwerner Gallery in New York, a big retrospective show of Crumb stuff, an enormous amount of material. And on one wall, they're not originals, they are the printed sheets of the underground papers that he worked for in the late 60s, including covers. So it's not the original, they're just put up there as if to say, this is what people saw in 1967 and 68 when Crumb burst onto the scene. These are the pieces of paper. And one of them was the Gothic Blimp Works number, I'm going to say 3. I worked for a few later issues. And it's 2 guys standing in a suburban street looking like, just 2 big white men in suits. And they're shaking hands. And one is saying, hi, I'm abnormal. And the other was saying, hi, I'm maladjusted. And when I saw that, I laughed for like an hour and a half without getting stoned even. I just laughed. The thought that I could even vaguely approach that never entered my mind. I just thought, sure I can.
Yeah.
I picked up my first comics were done with a speedball. I think it was a speedball number 3 or 4, a round nib, completely the wrong tool for the job.
Yeah.
Which
is also a Crumb reference, with the right tool for the job when he shows up with a vacuum cleaner.
I just had a bottle of India ink and I had a speedball and I did these. I didn't even erase the pencil lines. I remember my first strip was published by Screw when it was a
Al Goldstein.
tabloid. Yeah, Al Goldstein, and Steve Heller was the art director, and then he became the art director of the New York Times Book Review.
I forgot he was.
And he's now the dean of the illustration department of School of Visual Arts, and we see each other all the time.
Yeah.
He published my first strip, and I remember when it came out, I saw all these horrible, gray lines all around everything. I said, "What the hell happened?" He said, "Well, I should have told you. You should have erased the pencil lines after you." It was kind of his fault in a way, but he said,
Any cartoonist knows.
So I'm teaching you a lesson. I also asked him many, many years after he published my first strip, I said, what went through your head? Why did you decide to publish me? And he said, because you drew to the right proportions. He said, everybody that came in, this is in the heyday of the hippie era, they just drew all kinds of sizes, too small, too big, everything out of proportion. His job then was to get photostats made and rearrange the panels so that they would fit either a full page or a half page 10 by 15 tabloid. I had drawn a half page. I had measured the previous issue of Screw, and I had drawn it exactly the same size. He was very happy to see that.
Your scientific rigor launched your career. That's a great thing.
Anyway, in terms of just drawing and getting better at your craft, it's perseverance and hard work, really, for me.
Do you wish you'd gone to graphic novels earlier? And do you wish you were, doing those instead of the daily?
No.
Or do you feel that the daily was,
the daily,
necessary?
The daily
for everything?
led to the graphic novels.
Yeah. Still, do you wish you jumped earlier into this?
Yeah,
this form?
I mean, I could have jumped in earlier, but I didn't. And luckily, I'm still healthy, and I don't see any reason why I can't do a few more of these.
Yeah. For that very reason.
The daily,
the practice
if you
of it,
really look at it, the daily is full of long stories. Sometimes five strips, sometimes 48 strips. I did a 48 strip series about my father, where the current Griffith character goes back to Brooklyn and meets the little kid Griffith character, and they go upstairs in the attic where they weren't supposed to go, and they find my father, and then my father and Mr. Toad's head are interchanged at various points. So I was doing, the rhythm of doing something longer that I had when I was working in underground comics surfaced quite a bit during the years when I was doing the daily. If you look at the Zippy quarterlies, with just a few exceptions, each one of them has one long story in it. Mm-hmm. And they go for anywhere from, 3 weeks to 7-8 weeks. So I can't help but think that organically, I think I was literally moving closer and closer to doing a graphic novel through the daily strip. I was also doing things in the daily strip that I do a lot in the graphic novels, which is kind of a movie homage, where when you start a scene, you make an exterior shot of the scene before you go into the scene.
Yeah.
So I had been drawing buildings and streets and what are called in movies are called establishing shots. I'd been doing that in the daily strip more and more. And then in 2007, I created this town where all the pinheads lived, where Zippy lived happily, called Dingberg. And Dingberg became like a real place. It had streets with names. It had buildings that people lived in and worked in. Outside the city was a giant ho-ho forest. There was a beatnik enclave. So it was my ideal city and Zippy's ideal city. And, of course, with a nod to Duckburg from Karl Barks.
Yeah. I just recorded with Seth earlier today, and he actually built his fake city in Canada, his little...
That's right.
Town
his fake cartoonist.
Dominion.
Yes.
Yeah, he built this whole thing. So I imagine this, weird little styrofoam cutouts you're making of the city down in your studio.
In one of the iterations of trying to make the Zippy movie, this was actually the Zippy animated show, so this was 1998, 99, the person the producer, whatever you want to call her, this was with the Sunbow Company. They did The Tick. Mm-hmm. That was their big claim to fame. This producer said to me, okay, the scripts are coming along great. We had 4 scripts that everybody liked. But when we go to animation, you need to give the animators a map. And I said, do you mean, is that a metaphor? Or a real map? It has to be a map. So where does each place in your story, where is it in relation to the other places? She said, there's a map of Springfield for the Simpsons. There was, and it changes, but there is always a map.
Yeah.
A literal map on the wall where the animators are, or where the artists are too, the writers. And so I had to make a map. And not just a map, but I had to show what it was like between one location and another, like what was, if you walked down that street, what did it look like? So I did all that. And that was a precursor to Dingberg, too.
Yeah, was it just Diner, Muffler Man?
Pretty much. Zippy lived in a fur-lined fallout shelter. The entrance to the fallout shelter was disguised. It just looked like grass. It was astroturf, I guess. But right next to it was a giant doggy diner dog head, which was he spoke to regularly. It was like an oracle. And there was a donut shop right on the corner. It was a fantasy landscape for Zippy. Not just Zippy, but all the other characters. And Griffith was in the show, and he lived in the Griffith Observatory high on a hill, looking down on all of the town. Yeah.
Do you keep a notepad at your nightstand or anything, or do you wake up with just oddball phrases that you have to write down? I'm sure you keep one with you regularly, but when you wake up in the middle of the night, is there I have to write down these words? And,
absolutely. It happens a lot.
I assumed, but
Yes, and sometimes it just ruins my sleep.
Yeah.
I can remember many times either waking up or not being able to fall asleep, and having an idea for a story or a strip or, a daily strip or something to do with one of my longer narratives, and grabbing from my Post-it thing and writing it quickly, right off exactly what I was thinking, not censoring myself or anything. Then trying to go back to sleep, and another thought would come, and then another, and then another. In the morning, you read those things. Some of them pretty good. A lot of them not so good. There's a Seinfeld episode where Jerry is asking everybody he sees. He made a note as he was waking up, and he thought it was a note to himself about a great comedy, a great joke. But he can't read it. His handwriting was so sloppy. So he goes, everybody he sees, he says, "Can you please read this?" And they always read something completely different from the other person. And you find out at the end that he did indeed say something, and they show it to you because he's watching TV, and really it was just a line from a TV show that stuck in his head. Yeah. So that was all it was. But creative people, probably all writers, cartoonists, whatever.
Yeah, I just wonder, with the daily and with the absurdism of some of the language, whether you just wake up with, okay, that's. Let me just put this down quick. I'll get to this when I...
yes, those are the ones that usually wind up being used, just the phrases, the absurdist, word jazz, Zen bomb phrases. Yeah. Those tend to get used, but not necessarily the longer narrative ideas. They tend to sometimes... I mean, it's so funny. They seem... You write them down... I fall back asleep, or I try to fall back asleep, and think that is so incredible. That is so great. I'm really glad. Because if you don't write something down like that, you'll never remember it. Just like a dream. You won't remember it unless you write it down. And then I get up in the morning and read it. It was so disappointing. What was I thinking? That's so dumb.
I lost a night's sleep over this.
Yeah. What can you...
One thing I meant to ask about Schlitzie, throughout the book, he gets cross-gendered on the sideshow. They always present him as female. Mm-hmm. Any idea what that was about?
Yeah.
I mean, he's wearing a muumuu, which is lucky for you because that ends up inspiring Zippy. But
two reasons. The first being pure sideshow exoticness. This guy, Ward Hall, who was his last manager, told me, if the sideshow freak was female, it was more exciting and forbidden to the general public.
Okay.
So if you have a three-legged woman and a three-legged man, you go with the three-legged woman.
Yeah.
Okay, it's sexist, I guess.
But it worked?
It works. Okay. It got the people into the sideshow tent. The other reason he had a gown, and this was more true later in his life than it was earlier, is that, like a child, he needed a diaper. Yeah. So he had an adult diaper, and it was a lot easier to change the diaper if he wore a gown than if he wore pants. Although in his last year or so of life, the pictures of him show him wearing pants. So don't get that. Wilf Krakowski said that he watched Schlitzie's urine bag being removed.
Yeah, that's referenced in the later days of Schlitzie in the book.
So. Wilf was rooming next door to Schlitzie in a hotel. He saw that happen. So wherever Schlitzie was, he always had a caretaker. Sometimes it was just the manager, but not usually, because the manager had a lot of other jobs. Either another sideshow person, the performer, would be given an extra stipend for being the caretaker, or sometimes a caretaker would be hired just for that purpose. At one point, he had an actual nurse. I have pictures of her. I don't know how long that lasted, but she traveled with him. Other times, like in the book, the sort of retired sword swallower was his caretaker, who was paid just to do that. So,
have you heard? I know the book's only been out about a month and a half. Has there been anyone who knew Schlitzie or someone who knew a family member who knew him? Anything surfaced since the book is?
Yeah, including just today. Somebody that came up to me to have the book signed said they saw Schlitzie in the Toronto sideshow in the 60s.
50-something years ago. Yeah.
Yep.
And you think you may have or probably didn't in the California days. You mentioned something about like seeing some circuses, and you wonder if you'd ever seen sideshow characters like that in your childhood.
My sideshow experience is pretty limited. I saw the Ringling Brothers Barnum and Bailey Circus at least 3 times at Madison Square Garden in the 50s as a kid. I remember it because it was the most disorienting experience of my childhood.
Yeah.
To sit in, I guess we were sitting in seats that were equidistant from each ring. So there was a ring in front of us, and then there was a giant ring on left and right. And each ring, and this was what they did, was a separate performance was going on. One ring was, a woman doing, acrobatic tricks on the back of a horse that was running in the circle. In the middle were clowns. On the other side was an aerialist. It was
just too much.
It was too much, but in a good way.
Yeah.
And combined with the cotton candy hide, so that was very intense for me. But there was no sideshow to the Madison Square Garden didn't have a sideshow. But in 1957, my father was very odd in his relationship to me. We were not close. I wish we were. As just before he died, we got a little close. He didn't know how to be a father. He didn't have a father. He grew up without a father. So he would try to be a father in odd ways. All of a sudden, he would take me somewhere as like a father and son trip. He would take me into the city once. He took me to the Bowery once in New York in the 50s for the purpose of showing me the Bowery bum so that I wouldn't become one. Okay. This, my son, is what you sink to if you don't finish high school or whatever.
And don't go to art school, kid. Yeah.
Right. He was not happy about that. So one day he woke up, and I was 13, and he said, get dressed, we're going to the circus. Okay. The Ringling Brothers, Barnum and Bailey, one of their last tent shows was in Suffolk County, Long Island. So we get there, and, the sideshow is a corridor, really, leading to the main big tent. The purpose of a sideshow is to pull people in and make them spend a dime and a quarter along the way, and then wind up in the big tent. So you kind of had to go to the sideshow. The outdoor tent show was part of it. So we go to the sideshow. I don't remember anything about pinheads, but there was a giant, and his name was Jake Earl. His real name was Jake Ehrlich. I've read his biography. Jake Earl was 8'6". At least he said he was. He was very, very big. Yeah. He was dressed as a cowboy for some reason. Probably to show off gigantic boots. He had boots that were 3
7-league boots.
Yeah, right. 17 league boots. So anyway, so there's the giant. He did some routines and some cowboy routines with a lariat and things, and the talker told tall tales about him. And then I noticed to the side where it was a box, and they were replicas of the ring that he was wearing on his finger. It said 50 cents for a replica of Jake Earl's ring. So I said to my dad, I'd love to get one of those. Can I have that? And he said, Bill, I'll give it to you. I'll give you the 50 cents, but you have to ask the giant to put it on. You have to make sure that this is not a hoax, that's his
size.
Exact size. I remember it was made out of lead.
Jeez.
I mean, it literally rubbed off on your finger. There's lead. And I trepidatiously approached him and I asked him if he would put the ring on. And he said, "Get out of here, kid, you bother me." And he literally pushed me away. And my father was triumphant. He looked at me and he said, "You see, things are not always as they seem. You can't always believe what you're told."
That's probably the best life lesson you were going to get out of him when you really get down to it. You know, my old man's one was, you shouldn't trust anybody, especially me. And that really held up over the 50 years so far.
Okay. Well,
there's all sorts of stories I'll tell you off mic about that.
Yeah, fathers give all kinds of... Fathers are supposed to give advice, right?
Yeah.
Mothers are supposed to be nurturing, but fathers are supposed to give you life lessons. Right.
Turns out they're very ill prepared for that, generally. Last weird question. I don't think we touched on last time. You mentioned teaching at SVA. Do you wish there were comics studies when you were coming up? Do you wish you could have studied comics in making comics in a college setting?
The fact is, I could have.
Yeah.
The School of Visual Arts was a cartooning school. It was only a 2-year program. And my parents, it was tough enough to pay the $800 a year tuition for Pratt, but they weren't going to give me money to go to college that was for no degree. But, you know, Bern Hogarth started the School of Visual Arts, so it was a cartooning. I don't know, you call it a school. It was a 2-year course, a program.
Yeah.
But at that time, well, I touch upon it in Invisible Ink because I was being, in effect, tutored indirectly to be a cartoonist through my mother's lover, Lawrence Larrier, by bringing all of his books, his cartoons home. So I was sort of steeped in them. Had he actually mentored me, and maybe my mother had divorced my father and married him, and had he actually become my father, not just my shadow father, yes, I might have become a cartoonist much earlier. I might have taken courses, whatever.
It's one of the creepiest and most haunting passages of Invisible Ink. Your renditions of what your work would have looked like under his tutelage. As
important as he was to me in bending me eventually towards being a cartoonist, his own work was not inspiring.
Right.
He was a hack. The only admirable work of his I could really point to would be his detective novels. In which the detective was a cartoonist. And so it's a world of, all the stories take place, most of them, in a milieu of cartoonists in New York in the 40s and 50s.
Yeah, so we're capturing that vibe is more compelling than his actual work itself.
Yeah, so...
have you thought of writing prose, or are you pretty much comics?
I like to write essays. Yeah. I'm writing an essay right now, literally. Another guy who had a huge influence on me and led me into being a cartoonist was my next door neighbor when I grew up in Levittown, Ed Emshwiller.
Yeah.
Science fiction illustrator, one of the top 5, I would say, of the late 40s to the early 60s. And he was doing it 25 feet away from me in Levittown.
And you were a figure in some of the covers, right?
He would knock on the door once in a while and say, Can one of you come out? I need someone to pose. Yeah. And he'd take us up to his studio upstairs next door, and he would take Polaroids of us, fully dressed.
Yeah. Again, nothing untoward here.
Nothing untoward.
Yeah. And
they were just shots because he wanted to get everything right. He was a master painter. He was as good, at least as good technically as any Saturday Evening Post or Collier's or Look artists like Rockwell or any of the others. He was just hugely skillful. Anyway, so he, what was I?
You're working on an essay about him.
What?
You're working on an essay about him?
Right. So about a year ago, I got an email from a gallery in Philadelphia saying that they are now putting together a huge retrospective of Ed Emshwiller's work, all of his work, all of his science fiction work, and all of his film and video work, which are 2 entirely different chunks of his output. They don't connect with each other almost at all.
Yeah.
So they asked me to do a, 2,000 or 3,000 word essay on Ed Emshwiller, and I'm saying something in that essay. I hope they don't get too surprised or shocked by it, which is, I think his contribution is his science fiction work, not his later film and video work, which, the world of experimental film and video, those people, they like Emshwiller himself, they look upon his early work as commercial and not really worthy of much attention. I think the opposite. I think it's a shame that he quit at the height of his powers to become an artist with a capital A. I'm trying to not do this with any, rancor at all, because he also, in 1960, Ed Emshwiller started the transition from being a commercial science fiction illustrator to being what he would eventually become, which was a filmmaker and video maker. And the way he did it was he started painting, not his covers, not his realistic, beautiful covers. He started doing abstract paintings, one of which I own. And I went along with him. I thought,
this is art.
Commercial art is for, that's just to make money. What's really important is being an artist and expressing yourself. Art with a capital A is largely about self-expression. Comics with a capital A is about communication, not self-expression. Mm-hmm. I mean, it has room for everything, but it's about communicating and storytelling. But Emshwiller made that transition from illustration and storytelling and humor and satire that was loaded. If you look at his covers, that are loaded with Mad Magazine-esque humor, chicken fat all over the place, to being,
lofty,
the lofty artist. Yeah. And I went along with that. That had something to do with my leaving comics behind, actually, until I rediscovered them through Robert Crumb.
Look at you now. Stuck in a hotel room in Toronto with some schlub from New Jersey. Bill, thanks so much for coming back on the show.
It was my pleasure.
And that was Bill Griffith. His new book is Nobody's Fool, The Life and Times of Schlitzie the Pinhead, from Abrams Comic Arts. It is a wonderful book. I hope I conveyed that in the introduction and our conversation. And I'm so glad Bill was able to tell Schlitzie's story. He was able to find enough of it to evoke that era and the person behind this easily forgotten caricature. You should also check out Bill's previous book, Invisible Ink, from Fantagraphics, as well as the various collections of his Zippy the Pinhead strips that they've published over the years. And you should sign up for Bill's email to get daily doses of Zippy. That's at zippythepinhead.com, where you can also order inscribed copies of Nobody's Fool, as well as Invisible Ink, and get Zippy gear. That is ZIPPYTHEPINHEAD, zippythepinhead.com. And after we wrapped, I asked Bill, so, who you been reading? If you want to hear his answer to that, and get some extra conversation, you'll need to become a supporter of the Virtual Memories show so you can get access to our quarterly bonus podcast, Fear of a Square Planet. The first quarter 2019 episode features book recommendations and some extra conversation with Jerome Charon, Peter Cooper, Edmund White, Eva Hagberg, Mort Gerberg, James Osland, Joe Chardello, James Sturm, Martin Haglund, Bram Presser, and Nathan Englander. You can support the Virtual Memories show via patreon.com/VMSpod or paypal.me/VMSpod. I've got all sorts of goals and goodies in place for patrons, including that podcast, patron-only blog, handwritten show notes for every episode, my secret project that I really do have to get back to, and more. So go to patreon.com/VMSpod and support the art of fine conversation. Now, I recorded this during TCAF weekend, the Toronto Comic Arts Festival, which was a pretty expensive trip with flights, hotels, parking, dog sitting, etc. I did have a good business meeting during that time, so I'll expense a little of the trip to work, but This was otherwise all me. I did get 3 other podcasts out of it, one of which is still coming with Carl Stevens, so that spreads out some of the cost. Still, if you want to help defray the cost of the Virtual Memories show, like web hosting, travel, equipment, coffee, or just toss me some money because you think the show is worth it, then visit patreon.com/VMSpod or paypal.me/VMSpod and make a one-time or recurring donation. A special thanks go out to Nick Bartosik, Michael Hacker, Michael Janizik, Fred Kish, Jonathan Kranz, Kevin Katila, Jack Les Camella, Teresa Lewis, Stephen Nadler, Jim Ottaviani, Payne Prophet, Dmitry Samarov, Buzz Sawyer, Stephen Solomon, Greg Tanner, Ford Thomas, and Garrett Zecker for going over and above in their support of the Virtual Memories show. We have the full list of show supporters at chimeraobscura.com/VM. Now, our music for this episode is Fella by Hal Mayforth, used with permission from the artist. You check out my episode with Hal from the summer of 2018 to learn more about his fine art and his cartooning, and to check out his music, you can go to soundcloud.com/Mayforth, and that's MAY4TH. And that's it for this week's episode of the Virtual Memories Show. Thanks so much for listening. We'll be back next week with Boris Fishman, the novelist and author of the new memoir, Savage Feast. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show and download past episodes at the iTunes Store. You can also find all our episodes and get on our email list at either of our websites, vmspod.com or chimeraobscura.com/VM. You can also follow the Virtual Memories Show on Twitter and Instagram at VMSpod, at virtualmemoriespodcast.tumblr.com, and on YouTube, Spotify, and TuneIn.com by searching for Virtual Memories Show. And if you like this podcast, please tell your friends, talk it up on social media, and go to iTunes, look up the Virtual Memories Show, and leave a rating and maybe a review for us. It all goes to helping us build a bigger audience. Now, you've been listening to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth. Keep reading, keep making art, and keep the conversation going.